Now, the types of tree archetypes that we're looking at again, the triangle on the stick. So when I approach these types of trees, typically spruce trees, I begin by creating a kind of basic measurement. It doesn't have to be very accurate, but I add these two anchors, one for the top of the tree and one for the bottom of the tree. Okay. And I also estimate the width in a similar manner, right? I look for the widest point of the tree and I'll add another two anchor marks. So this indicates height and this indicates width. Okay. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's just a way for us um, to create a nice baseline for us to begin. So another thing I like to do is I like to consider the profile of the tree. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be a little abstract for a moment, and I'm going to build a profile of this tree using dots. And the reason why I choose dots is because it's the simplest form of mark making. Anybody can draw a dot. So there's no excuse, there's no reservation for feeling like it's over your head. Really, all I'm doing is creating a profile here, okay, that we are going to fill in. And it doesn't have to be 100% accurate. It just has to be vaguely accurate, just something that represents the basic shape of the subject. In this case, this white spruce here. Okay. And I'm not going to worry about the trunk just yet. Okay. So I like to start at the top and work my way down because I find that when I begin with the trunk of the tree, especially with spruce trees, I wind up making it a little bit too prevalent. I want to hide the trunk behind certain layers of foliage, right? As you see in real life. So what I do is I start at the top of the tree, and it's nice to have a sharp pencil for this. And let me bring my camera a little bit closer to the page so we can see a little better there. Okay. Is I'll go ahead and I'll start by creating a series of marks, basically lines and dashes that will represent the foliage. Okay. And I'm not worried about the trunk that runs down the center of the tree yet. I'm only concerned with the foliage first. That way, I can overlap, for example, let's say there's a space where we're not going to see the trunk. I can come into that space and it looks very natural. I'll go in and make these marks. And that way, when I draw the trunk later, I'll know not to draw the trunk there. So you'll see the trunk exposed in some places and covered in other places. That's a nice way to get a little bit of realism there. And I'm also looking at this tree not only from the perspective of an artist, but also as kind of a biologist as well. I'm seeing that this tree is obviously leaning slightly towards the sun, or it could also be leaning towards what we call a, um, a headwind. Okay, if there's a prevalent wind direction, typically the trees, especially these taller trees, kind of lean forward towards the wind, and that helps them to stay anchored in case they're in danger of being blown over. The next thing I'm looking at is the arrangement of branches. Okay. Now, some of these trees, and most trees, as a matter of fact, have an alternating branch arrangement, meaning that they're not opposite each other, right? But some trees will have a sort of a wagon wheel or a world um, sort of arrangement. That's something that you'll typically see on these types of trees, these little Christmas trees here. Okay. And what it means to have a world arrangement is essentially the tree branches grow from the trunk around each other. So that means that you can actually measure the years of the tree if you can count the whorls all the way from the bottom to the top. It usually gets one whorl, WHORL, each year. So it's important to remember as we do this type of mark making, not to press too hard, right? All I'm doing right now is I'm just letting the pencil dance across the page and I'm not putting much pressure on it at all. Okay, and that's because I'm using a lead that's pretty soft. It's a 2B softness, B as in boy. So that allows me to get a darker mark without having to press so hard. If you're using like a regular school pencil, that lead is harder than the lead I'm using, so you would have to press a little bit harder to get a darker mark. But you should be holding the pencil in a relaxed grip and just like I'm doing here. I'm not worried about the tree trunk just yet. I'm not worrying about getting perfect detail. All I'm doing is I'm building up on this outline that I kind of estimated earlier. And that was a kind of a blueprint for me, right? I'm like an architect following the blueprints. I'm not tracing anything right now. I'm just working within um, the profile that I created here. And that way I'm able to look at things like light value. Okay, where are the dark spots and where are the light spots, the highlights? And you can see if there's a darker area where there's shadow, you can add more marks, and that will help to create that shadow effect without really having to do much shading, right? So I started at the top, and I guessed the height and the width of the tree, and then after that, I did an outline or profile using dots. And you're going to see that because of the way that the tree is growing, see how the branches are, as they are up on the top half of the tree, they're bending slightly upwards. As I get towards the middle and bottom of the tree, I'm going to notice that, okay, the branches are going to start to shift in a downward direction, but their tips are going to be pointed up a little bit. Usually on the north, and this is in the northern hemisphere, on the north sides of the trees, you're going to notice that the branches typically will grow more vertical. And on the south side of the tree, the branches will grow horizontal, more horizontal. It's an interesting phenomenon, but it has to do with the tree maximizing its sunlight for photosynthesis. Okay. So right now it just kind of looks like a bunch of dots and a bunch of squiggly lines and maybe some shadow. So when you have to draw a single tree, yeah, you want to spend a little bit of extra time making sure that it looks a little bit more realistic than the trees in the background, right? And again, I'm not really worried about being too perfect with it. I don't want to treat it too precious, right? I want to just get an accurate enough representation of it so that it's consistent, so that it's following the rules that nature allows for it, and that's going to show the person who's looking at my drawing that I know what I'm doing, or at least it'll allow them to believe that we know what we're doing. So that goes back into the whole archetype thing. If a person is able to look at a triangle on a stick and interpret that as tree, surely this will be more than adequate for that type of interpretation. Okay. And because as artists, you're also magicians in a sense, you're master illusionists, you're creating things that the human mind is designed to find. Okay. We seek patterns, we seek consistency in nature. We also will notice if things are inconsistent too. And these are very powerful psychological tools for us to play with as artists because we're sort of manipulating the minds of all those people looking at our work. It's kind of interesting, right? So for now, I feel very comfortable with the amount of foliage that's on this tree. Now I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to start with the trunk. So that's somewhere down here. So I mentioned earlier the idea of the root system sort of being a little bit above ground before joining with the rest of the trunk. I think that's a really important thing to stress at this point because you want to give more character to your tree by making it as realistic as possible or behave in a more realistic manner. So since this tree is growing by itself in a tall field, I'll go ahead and I'll draw some grass around the base of the trunk on either side, both in front and behind, just like this. And I'm using a little bit of pressure now when I'm drawing the tree trunk because I want those lines to be a little bit darker than the grass and the plants surrounding the trunk of the tree. right? And there's also going to be some offshoots, some branches that may not have any foliage on them, or some broken branches. Those can stay nice and light. But as I travel up the tree, I'm going to be sure to cover up some of the trunk in areas where it might feel a little awkward. So as I come up here, I'm going to make the trunk also more narrow because when we reach the top, it's going to be very thin. Okay. And if these trees grow um, one whirl at a time, so to speak, you're going to, this is older tree down here, and this is younger tree up here. So that makes sense. So I'm making sure I'm not showing the trunk all the way through. There are some areas where you're just not going to see it through the foliage. There are other branches too that I'm not going to show as well, simply because we don't need to show them. That whole idea of the archetype, people understand that this is a tree. We don't have to sit there and draw every single branch for them so that they understand that it's a tree. They already do. And that saves us a lot of time and work and frustration. Okay, and remember that tree has a slight lean to it. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a lean just like this. Okay, so it should be feeling like it's sort of leaning this way a little bit more. Okay, there we go.